The coffee was cold by the time Mylene Carter noticed it. Steam long since dissipated into the fluorescent-lit break room of Denver General Hospital. Her scrubs bore the telltale stains of a 12-hour shift in the trauma ward blood, iodine, and the persistent smell of antiseptic that no amount of washing could completely remove. She sat alone at a corner table, medical journals spread before her like battle plans, her pen moving in precise annotations across pages already heavy with her careful handwriting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was 2:47 a.m., and while most of the hospital had settled into the quieter rhythm of night shift, Mylene remained wide awake. Sleep had become optional somewhere during her residency, a luxury she couldn't afford when there was always more to learn, more to understand, more ways to save lives that might otherwise be lost to ignorance or hesitation. Her apartment was only 15 minutes away, a modest one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades. The walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through the night, and the heating system clanged like a ghost in chains every time it kicked on. But rent was affordable on a resident's salary, and more importantly, it was close enough to the hospital that she could be there in minutes if needed. The building superintendent, Mrs. Chun, had grown accustomed to Mylene's irregular hours. Sometimes she would see the young doctor leaving at dawn, other times returning well past midnight. Always alone, always carrying the same worn leather bag that had belonged to her father, always with that focused expression that suggested her mind was processing information at speeds that left little room for small talk. Mylene's morning routine was choreographed with military precision. Alarm at 4:30, though she was usually awake before it sounded. Shower in exactly 6 minutes. Hot water was a luxury the building's ancient plumbing couldn't guarantee. Coffee, black, strong enough to dissolve spoons. A quick review of patient charts she had printed the night before. Annotations made in the margins with the same careful handwriting that had earned her top marks in medical school. The drive to Denver General took her through neighborhoods that told the story of a city in transition. Gentrification pushed eastward like a slow tide. Coffee shops and yoga studios, replacing corner markets and laundromats. Mylene had watched the transformation over her 3 years of residency, seen how the changing landscape affected the patients who found their way to her trauma bay. Her car was a 15-year-old Honda Civic that her father had helped her buy during medical school. The odometer had rolled past 200,000 miles, but the engine still ran smoothly thanks to meticulous maintenance. Every 3,000 miles, oil changes, tire pressure checked weekly. A small emergency kit in the trunk that included not just jumper cables and a spare tire, but also basic medical supplies and a battery-powered radio. The hospital parking garage knew her schedule better than most people did. Third level, space 47B, the same spot every day because routine eliminated variables, and variables could mean the difference between life and death when seconds counted. Her employee badge, worn on a retractable cord, had accumulated the small scratches and worn edges that marked someone who had been through the crucible of emergency medicine. Dr. Patricia Whitman, the attending physician who oversaw the trauma ward, had noticed Mylene's peculiar habits early in her residency. The way she positioned herself near exits during staff meetings, how she ate lunch facing the cafeteria entrance, back to the wall, the careful inventory she took of medical supplies, not just counting but memorizing locations, as if preparing for scenarios that existed only in her imagination. Other residents found Mylene's intensity unsettling. During their brief conversations between cases, they would talk about movies, weekend plans, the dating lives that residency had all but eliminated. Mylene would listen politely, contribute when directly asked, but her attention seemed perpetually divided. As if part of her mind was always processing information they couldn't see. The trauma bay was where Mylene truly came alive. Her movements became fluid, economical, each action serving a specific purpose in the complex choreography of emergency medicine. She could start in 4-line while simultaneously assessing respiratory function and calculating drug dosages, her hands working independently while her mind processed multiple data streams with computer-like efficiency. Nurses noticed that equipment seemed to function better when Mylene was working. The defibrillator that had been acting up for weeks would suddenly perform flawlessly during her shifts. Monitors that gave inconsistent readings would stabilize when she adjusted them. Some attributed it to luck, but the more observant staff recognized something else, an intuitive understanding of how systems worked, how they failed, and how they could be coaxed back to optimal function. The hospital's electronic record system contained Mylene's official biography in neat digital fields. Born in Colorado Springs. Undergraduate degree in biochemistry from the University of Colorado. Medical degree from Denver Medical School. Board scores in the 98th percentile. Letters of recommendation that used words like exceptional, dedicated, and natural healer. But the records didn't capture the gaps in her history. The 2 years between undergraduate and medical school that she listed simply as research assistant, without specifying the nature of the research or the institution where it was conducted. The emergency contact information that listed only a post office box. The background check that had taken longer than usual, requiring additional verification from sources that preferred to remain unnamed. Dr. James Sullivan, the chief of emergency medicine, had hired Mylene based on her credentials and an interview that had lasted 3 hours instead of the usual 90 minutes. Something about her responses to hypothetical scenarios had impressed him, not just the medical knowledge, but the way she approached problems from angles others hadn't considered. During one simulation, presented with a mass casualty scenario, most candidates had focused on triage protocols and resource allocation. Mylene had asked about the building's structural integrity, alternative evacuation routes, and the hospital's ability to maintain operations if primary power and communication systems failed. Questions that went beyond standard emergency medicine into areas that suggested experience with situations where normal protocols might not apply. The trauma ward attracted a specific type of physician, those who thrived under pressure, who could make life or death decisions with incomplete information while maintaining the steady hands and clear thinking that separated professionals from heroes. Mylene fit the profile perfectly, perhaps too perfectly, as if she had been specifically trained for scenarios that went beyond what medical school typically taught. Her colleagues respected her competence, but found her difficult to read. Dr. Kevin Marshall, a second-year resident who had started the same year as Mylene, had tried multiple times to engage her in conversations that went beyond medical topics. She would deflect with professional courtesy, steering discussions back to patient care or recent research, maintaining a friendly but impenetrable boundary. The few personal details Mylene shared seemed carefully chosen, generic enough to satisfy social expectations without revealing anything substantive. She lived alone, didn't date anyone seriously, exercised regularly, but didn't specify where or how. Her hobbies included reading medical journals mostly, though sometimes she mentioned fiction without naming specific titles or authors. Staff meetings revealed another layer of Mylene's unusual background. When hospital administrators discussed security protocols or emergency preparedness, she would occasionally offer suggestions that demonstrated knowledge of systems and procedures that went far beyond what most physicians would know: how to secure a perimeter, how to establish communication redundancy, how to prioritize evacuation based on factors that had nothing to do with medical necessity. These contributions were always framed as common sense or things she had read about, but Dr. Whitman, who had served as a military physician early in her career, recognized something familiar in Mylene's perspective. The way she assessed rooms, The questions she asked about hospital security, the casual mention of protocols that sounded more like military doctrine than medical training. The hospital's annual disaster drill had showcased Myleen's abilities in ways that raised questions among the administrative staff. While other residents followed established protocols with varying degrees of success, Myleen had improvised solutions that hadn't been in any manual. When the simulated chemical spill required decontamination procedures, she had set up an efficient processing system that moved patients through triage faster than anyone had thought possible. Her performance during real emergencies was even more impressive. A multi-car accident that had overwhelmed the trauma bay found Myleen coordinating care for 7 patients simultaneously, her voice calm and clear as she directed nurses and technicians with the confidence of someone who had managed similar chaos before. Not the controlled chaos of medical training, but something messier, more unpredictable. The night shift offered a different perspective on Myleen's character. With fewer administrative staff and less supervision, the hospital revealed its true personality. Emergency medicine at 3 a.m. attracted a different population: victims of violence, overdoses, accidents that happened when most people were asleep. The cases that arrived during these hours often carried stories that day shift physicians never heard. Myleen handled these situations with a composure that impressed even veteran nurses. The domestic violence victim who wouldn't speak to male doctors opened up to her immediately. The gang member with multiple gunshot wounds somehow trusted her enough to provide information that helped police prevent retaliatory violence. The homeless veteran with infected wounds found in her someone who understood that dignity could be preserved even in the most degrading circumstances. Her approach to patient care revealed training that went beyond medical school. She knew how to talk to people who were lying, how to extract information from witnesses who were afraid to speak, how to provide comfort to those who had lost faith in the system's ability to protect them. These skills suggested experience with populations that most physicians encountered only in textbooks. The break room conversations during night shift tended toward topics that day shift staff avoided. War stories from veterans on the nursing staff, discussions of cases that had pushed everyone to their emotional limits, speculation about the motivations that drove people to hurt each other in creative and horrifying ways. Myleen participated in these conversations with an understanding that seemed too deep for someone whose only trauma experience had been gained during residency. She knew how to read the signs that indicated when a patient's story didn't match their injuries, how to recognize the behavioral patterns that suggested someone was carrying secrets that went beyond medical history. The hospital's Employee Assistance Program had reached out to her once routine contact that all residents received during their second year. The counselor, Dr. Rebecca Foster, had noted in her confidential files that Myleen declined all optional services while meeting minimum requirements, with responses that were textbook appropriate but emotionally distant. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When asked about stress management, Myleen had provided answers that sounded rehearsed, as if she had been coached on how to respond to such questions. Her coping mechanisms included exercise, meditation, and maintaining work-life balance standard. Responses that revealed nothing about how she actually processed the emotional demands of trauma medicine. The truth was that Myleen didn't need the hospital's counseling services because she had already developed her own methods for managing psychological pressure. Methods that had been tested under conditions far more extreme than anything Denver General could provide. But those methods, like so much of her background, remained carefully compartmentalized, accessible only when absolutely necessary. Her apartment reflected the same careful control that characterized her professional life. Furniture arranged for both comfort and tactical advantage. Windows that could be opened quickly from inside. A kitchen stocked with enough supplies to last several weeks without resupply. Books on medicine and emergency preparedness, but also volumes on subjects that had no obvious connection to her career: foreign languages, cultural anthropology, chemical engineering. The building's other residents knew her as the quiet doctor, who worked unusual hours and never caused problems. She paid her rent on time, kept her space clean, and helped elderly Mrs. Patterson with her groceries when their paths crossed in the hallway. A model tenant who blended seamlessly into the background of urban anonymity. But late at night, when the building settled into sleep, Mylene would sometimes stand at her window looking out over the city lights, her expression carrying a weight that had nothing to do with medical training. In those moments, she looked like someone carrying memories that official records could never capture, experiences that had shaped her in ways that went far beyond anything a residency program could provide. The announcement arrived on a Tuesday morning through official channels that few people at Denver General had clearance to access. Dr. Patricia Whitman received the notification in her secure email, marked with classification levels that hadn't been relevant to her work since her military service ended 15 years ago. The message was brief, clinical, and carried the weight of decisions made in rooms where civilian physicians were rarely welcome. Colonel David Harrison would be conducting a special assessment of medical personnel at select civilian facilities. His mission, officially described as Emergency Preparedness Evaluation, carried undertones that suggested something far more specific than routine disaster planning. The timeline was aggressive: 3 days' notice for a visit that could reshape careers and reveal capabilities that some staff members preferred to keep private. Harrison represented a new breed of military medical officer, one who understood that modern warfare required resources that existed beyond traditional military boundaries. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan had taught hard lessons about the need for civilian specialists who could be rapidly deployed to situations where conventional military medicine wasn't sufficient. His assessment program identified potential candidates for scenarios that couldn't be discussed in open forums. The hospital's administrative staff prepared for the visit with the nervous energy of students facing an exam they couldn't study for. Conference rooms were scrubbed clean, schedule is optimized to showcase the facility's most impressive capabilities, and staff members briefed on protocols that emphasized professionalism while revealing nothing that might compromise ongoing operations. Dr. James Sullivan, the chief of emergency medicine, had received a more detailed briefing through channels that required him to sign documents, acknowledging that disclosure of certain information would constitute a federal crime. The conversation had taken place in a secure facility 20 minutes from the hospital, in a room where cell phones were collected at the door and conversations were recorded for quality assurance purposes. The mission parameters were classified, but the personnel requirements were specific enough to narrow the candidate pool significantly. Medical expertise in trauma surgery, demonstrated ability to work under extreme pressure, psychological stability under conditions that pushed normal stress responses beyond their limits, and most importantly, a background that suggested experience with situations where standard protocols might not apply. Harrison's dossier on Mylene Carter was thicker than the files for other potential candidates, filled with inconsistencies that raised questions about what official records were designed to conceal rather than reveal. Her medical credentials were impeccable, her performance evaluations consistently exceptional, but the gaps in her background suggested experiences that didn't fit the profile of a typical civilian physician. The psychological evaluation that was part of her hospital employment had been conducted by Dr. Rebecca Foster, a civilian contractor who specialized in assessments for positions requiring security clearances. Foster's report, now part of Harrison's briefing materials, noted responses that indicated familiarity with high-stress environments and decision-making processes that went beyond normal medical training. When asked about her motivation for entering medicine, Mylene had provided answers that were technically correct, but emotionally hollow. Service to others, intellectual challenge. The satisfaction of saving lives, responses that could have been lifted from medical school application essays. But Foster's notes indicated micro-expressions and physiological responses that suggested deeper, more complex motivations. The timing of Harrison's visit coincided with a training exercise that would test the hospital's response to a mass casualty event. Official announcements described it as routine emergency preparedness, but the scenario parameters had been designed to identify personnel who could function effectively when normal resources and protocols were no longer available. Mylene received notification of the exercise through the same channels as other senior residents, but her response differed in ways that only trained observers would notice. While others focused on reviewing triage protocols and resource allocation procedures, she spent her preparation time studying building schematics, communication systems, and evacuation routes that weren't part of standard emergency planning. Exercise would simulate a chemical weapons attack on a major public gathering, creating casualty patterns and contamination challenges that pushed emergency response capabilities beyond normal limits. The scenario had been carefully crafted to require improvisation, creative problem-solving, and the ability to maintain effective medical care under conditions where standard safety protocols might compromise patient outcomes. Harrison arrived at Denver General accompanied by a small team of specialists whose credentials were impressive enough to command immediate respect from the hospital's senior staff. His manner was professional but distant, the bearing of someone accustomed to evaluating capabilities that couldn't be measured through conventional metrics. The colonel's background included combat medical experience in 3 different theaters of operation, advanced training in chemical and biological warfare countermeasures, and a classified assignment history that included development of protocols for medical operations in denied areas. His current mission represented the intersection of military necessity and civilian expertise, identifying resources that could be rapidly deployed when traditional military assets weren't sufficient. The initial briefing took place in the hospital's main conference room, attended by department heads and senior physicians who had been cleared for information that was carefully calibrated to reveal mission requirements without compromising operational security. Harrison's presentation focused on the evolving nature of medical threats, the need for adaptive response capabilities, and the importance of identifying personnel who could function effectively outside normal institutional frameworks. Mylene attended the briefing along with other trauma department staff, her presence unremarkable among colleagues who were equally qualified on paper. But Harrison's attention was drawn to subtle indicators that suggested experience with briefing formats that were more common in military than civilian settings. The way she positioned herself in the room, the questions she didn't ask, the familiarity with terminology that wasn't part of standard medical vocabulary. The exercise began at 0800 hours with simulated reports of multiple casualties from a downtown incident involving suspected chemical contamination. Initial information was fragmentary, deliberately confusing, designed to test decision-making capabilities when reliable intelligence wasn't available. Emergency response protocols were activated, but the scenario parameters quickly pushed normal procedures beyond their effective limits. Mylene's response to the initial alert differed from her colleagues in ways that became apparent only as the exercise progressed. While others focused on preparing the trauma bay according to established protocols, she began implementing modifications that weren't in any manual but proved essential as the scenario escalated. Makeshift decontamination procedures, communication redundancy, resource conservation measures that suggested experience with situations where resupply wasn't guaranteed. The first wave of simulated casualties arrived with contamination patterns that required immediate decisions about treatment priorities. Standard triage protocols weren't designed for scenarios where providing care to some patients might compromise the ability to treat others. where saving lives required choices that civilian medicine typically avoided. Harrison observed from a position that allowed him to monitor multiple staff members simultaneously, but his attention increasingly focused on Mylene's performance. Her movements were efficient, decisive, lacking the hesitation that characterized colleagues who were encountering these decision matrices for the first time. She treated each simulated casualty as if lives actually depended on her choices, maintaining the intensity that separated professionals from those who were merely competent. The exercise escalated according to predetermined parameters that were designed to overwhelm normal response capabilities. Communication systems experienced planned failures, backup equipment malfunctioned on schedule, and resource constraints forced difficult decisions about which patients could be saved and which would have to be sacrificed for the greater good. Dr. Kevin Marshall, working alongside Mylene during the exercise, noticed her calm efficiency in situations that pushed his own stress responses to their limits. When the simulated chemical agent required treatment protocols that weren't part of standard emergency medicine, she adapted existing procedures with modifications that suggested knowledge of specialized countermeasures. The most challenging phase of the exercise involved a scenario where normal evacuation routes were compromised, requiring creative solutions for patient movement under conditions that prioritize speed over comfort. Mylene coordinated the response with a level of tactical awareness that impressed even Harrison's team of military specialists, organizing civilian staff into effective units that accomplished objectives with minimal supervision. Her ability to function as a force multiplier became apparent as the exercise progressed. Other personnel worked more effectively when she was present, not because she assumed command, but because her competence created confidence that allowed others to perform at their highest levels. The phenomena was difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Teams that included Mylene consistently outperformed groups with equal qualifications but different leadership dynamics. The psychological pressure of the exercise revealed aspects of personality that normal hospital operations couldn't test. When simulated casualties began arriving faster than they could be processed, when resources became critically limited, when decisions had to be made without complete information, Mylene maintained the steady composure that separated those who thrived under pressure from those who merely survived it. Harrison's evaluation focused on indicators that weren't part of standard medical assessment. How personnel reacted when familiar procedures proved inadequate, whether they could adapt to changing circumstances without losing effectiveness. Most importantly, whether they could make difficult decisions and live with the consequences when lives hung in the balance. The exercise conclusion brought together all participants for a debriefing that was designed to extract lessons learned, while observing reactions to stress that had been carefully calibrated to push normal responses beyond their comfortable limits. Most staff members showed visible signs of fatigue, the emotional exhaustion that came from confronting scenarios where medical training alone wasn't sufficient. Mylene's demeanor during the debriefing suggested someone who had processed the exercise as a learning experience rather than a test of her limits. Her questions focused on improving response times and resource allocation, technical issues that indicated analytical thinking rather than emotional processing. The contrast with colleagues who were still absorbing the psychological impact of difficult decisions was subtle but significant. Harrison's preliminary assessment, recorded in notes that would be classified upon completion, identified Mylene as a candidate whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters for civilian medical personnel. Her performance during the exercise suggested experience with high stress, decision-making that went beyond what could be acquired through conventional training. The colonel's team conducted individual interviews with selected personnel, conversations that were framed as routine follow-up but served to probe backgrounds and motivations that couldn't be assessed through direct observation. These sessions took place in a conference room, that had been temporarily converted into something resembling an interrogation facility, complete with recording equipment and security protocols that emphasized the serious nature of the evaluation. Mylene's interview was scheduled. She received notification through channels that suggested this wasn't a routine conversation. The timing, the location, the request that she arrive without discussing the meeting with colleagues, all indicators that her performance had attracted attention from people who operated outside normal hospital hierarchies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away the carefully constructed identity Mylene had built during her residency, revealing capabilities and experiences that she had worked to keep hidden. Harrison represented the world she had left behind, the missions and obligations that had shaped her in ways that civilian life couldn't erase. The catalyst for revelation was approaching, carried forward by military necessity and the recognition that some situations required personnel who understood that serving others sometimes meant accepting risks that went far beyond what most people were willing to consider. The comfortable anonymity of her civilian identity was about to collide with the realities of a world where her unique capabilities were needed once again. The interview room had been stripped of everything except 2 chairs and a metal table that reflected the overhead lighting in ways that created uncomfortable shadows. Colonel Harrison sat with his back to the only window, a positioning choice that forced Mylene to face the brightness while he remained silhouetted against the Denver skyline. The psychological advantage was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that this conversation would be conducted on terms that she hadn't chosen. The recording equipment was visible but not prominent. 2 small devices that captured audio and video with the kind of clarity that suggested this wasn't the first time. This room had been used for conversations that required documentation. A water pitcher and 2 glasses sat between them, untouched, serving more as props than refreshments in a scene that felt rehearsed despite being entirely spontaneous. Harrison opened a manila folder that contained documents Mylene couldn't see from her position, but the thickness suggested information that went far beyond her hospital employment records. His movements were deliberate, economical, the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to conversations where every gesture carried meaning and every pause was an opportunity for observation. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone conducting official business. "Your performance during yesterday's exercise was remarkable, particularly your modifications to the decontamination protocols and your coordination of personnel during the resource shortage phase. Those aren't skills typically acquired during civilian medical training." Mylene's response was carefully measured. The same professional courtesy she extended to hospital administrators and visiting specialists. "Emergency medicine requires adaptability, Colonel. We're trained to improvise when standard procedures aren't sufficient. Yesterday's scenario pushed all of us to think creatively about solutions." The answer was perfect in its mundane reasonableness, exactly what any competent physician might say when complimented on their performance during a challenging exercise. But Harrison had conducted enough of these interviews to recognize deflection, disguised as cooperation, explanations that were technically accurate while revealing nothing of substance. He turned a page in the folder, a gesture that seemed casual but was calculated to create tension. "The modifications you implemented weren't creative adaptations of civilian protocols. They were precise applications of military doctrine for chemical weapons exposure in field conditions. Doctrine that isn't taught in medical schools or emergency management courses." The statement hung in the air between them like a challenge waiting to be acknowledged or denied. Mylene's expression didn't change, but Harrison noticed the micro-hesitation before her response, the brief calculation that preceded carefully chosen words. "I've done extensive reading on emergency preparedness," she said, maintaining eye contact despite the disadvantageous lighting. "Chemical weapons protocols are documented in professional literature. Any physician serious about trauma medicine would be familiar with countermeasures for unconventional threats." Harrison consulted his notes again. a performance that emphasized the depth of his preparation while giving Mylene time to consider where this conversation was heading. The folder contained psychological profiles, background investigations, and surveillance reports that painted a picture of someone whose official biography was carefully constructed fiction. Dr. Rebecca Foster's psychological evaluation noted several interesting anomalies in your responses. Harrison continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral while introducing information that couldn't be dismissed as routine inquiry. Stress responses consistent with combat exposure. Hypervigilance behaviors. Risk assessment patterns that suggested familiarity with threat environments that most civilians never encounter. The accusation was indirect but unmistakable, a suggestion that Mylene's background contained experiences that weren't reflected in her official records. She shifted slightly in her chair, the first visible sign that Harrison's questions were penetrating the careful composure she had maintained since entering the room. Dr. Foster's evaluation was conducted 3 years ago during my initial employment screening. Mylene replied, her voice carrying the slight edge that indicated growing discomfort with the direction of the conversation. I was finishing medical school, dealing with the normal stress of beginning residency. Any anomalies in my responses would reflect the pressure of transitioning from academic to clinical medicine. Harrison's smile was brief and entirely without warmth, the expression of someone who had heard similar explanations from subjects, who underestimated his ability to distinguish truth from carefully crafted fiction. He reached into the folder and removed a photograph, placing it on the table where Mylene could see it clearly. The image showed a woman in military fatigues, her face partially obscured by combat gear, standing beside a medical evacuation helicopter in what appeared to be a desert environment. The figure was recognizable despite the helmet and tactical vest. The same bone structure and posture that characterized the civilian physician sitting across from Harrison. Operation Sandstorm, Afghanistan, 2019, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of classified information being revealed for official purposes. Combat medic attached to Special Operations Command. Multiple decorations for valor under fire, including a Silver Star for actions during the evacuation of Forward Operating Base Kessler. Mylene stared at the photograph for several seconds, her carefully maintained professional demeanor cracking to reveal something deeper and more complex. The woman in the image represented a life she had worked to leave behind, experiences that had shaped her in ways that civilian existence couldn't accommodate. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said, but the words lacked conviction. The photograph was evidence that couldn't be dismissed through casual denial, proof that her carefully constructed civilian identity was built on foundations that could be excavated by people with sufficient resources and determination. Harrison placed a second document on the table, this one bearing official military letterhead and classification, markings that indicated information requiring special handling procedures. The pages contained service records, commendation citations, and medical reports that documented injuries consistent with combat exposure. Staff Sergeant Mylene Carter, 5th 10th Forward Surgical Team, Harrison read from the document, his voice taking on the formal cadence used for official recitation. Distinguished herself through exceptional courage and medical skill during multiple combat operations. Awarded the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism during the defense and evacuation of Forward Operating Base Kessler, where her actions under direct enemy fire saved the lives of 14 wounded personnel. The citation continued with details that painted a picture of someone whose service record represented the highest standards of military medical care under the most demanding circumstances. Multiple combat deployments, specialized training in battlefield medicine, psychological evaluations that praised her ability to function effectively under conditions that would overwhelm most personnel. The final entry in your military file is particularly interesting, Harrison continued, turning to a page marked with additional security classifications. Medical discharge following psychological evaluation that recommended removal from combat duties. The reason cited was inability to function effectively in high-stress combat environments due to excessive risk aversion. The words hit Mylene like physical blows, reopening wounds that had never properly healed despite years of civilian life. That had allowed her to rebuild her identity around competence and professional respect. The military's final judgment of her service reduced her to a diagnosis that ignored the complexities of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The evacuation of Phoebe Kessler required someone to remain behind to coordinate medical care for personnel who couldn't be moved immediately. Harrison read from the file, his voice carrying no judgment, but emphasizing facts that spoke for themselves. Standard protocol called for volunteer personnel to maintain the medical station while the base was evacuated. You refused the assignment and requested immediate evacuation with the departing convoy. The accusation was delivered with clinical precision, each word chosen to reconstruct the circumstances that had ended Mylene's military career and forced her transition to civilian life. The room's silence amplified the weight of decisions made under pressure that had defined her more than any medal or commendation. 14 wounded personnel were subsequently evacuated by helicopter after the base perimeter was secured by arriving reinforcements, Harrison continued, reading from reports that documented the outcome of choices made in circumstances where every option carried potentially lethal consequences. Your refusal to volunteer for the rearguard action was noted in official reports as evidence of unsuitability for continued service in combat medical positions. Mylene's response, when it finally came, carried the accumulated weight of years spent carrying the judgment that her final military action had branded her as someone who chose personal safety over the lives of those she was trained to protect. The words came slowly, forced through psychological barriers that had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly this kind of examination. I had been in continuous combat for 18 months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying emotional intensity that filled the room. 3 deployments without rotation home. I had seen things, done things, lost people in ways that don't appear in official reports. When they asked for volunteers to stay behind, I couldn't do it anymore. The confession represented a breaking point that Harrison had been trained to recognize and exploit, the moment when carefully maintained defenses cracked under the pressure of having to justify decisions that couldn't be adequately explained to those who hadn't faced similar circumstances. The psychological evaluation that recommended your discharge noted symptoms consistent with combat stress reaction, Harrison said, his tone softening slightly as he transitioned from interrogation to something that resembled counseling. Hypervigilance, emotional numbing, inability to sleep, persistent anxiety about mission parameters that exceeded normal tactical concerns. The clinical terminology couldn't capture the reality of nights spent lying awake calculating casualty probabilities, days when the sound of helicopters triggered responses that made normal medical practice impossible, the constant awareness that every decision could mean the difference between life and death for people whose trust was absolute and unquestioning. What the evaluation didn't note, Harrison continued, consulting additional pages that contained information not included in standard military records, was that your excessive risk aversion had saved more lives than any other medic in your unit. Your refusal to follow standard protocols when they would have resulted in unnecessary casualties. Your insistence on modified evacuation procedures that other personnel considered overly cautious. The revelation reframed Mylene's military service in ways that contradicted the official narrative that had defined her transition to civilian life. Her so-called cowardice had been intelligence. Her excessive caution had been wisdom gained through experience that others hadn't survived to acquire. The volunteers who stayed behind at Phoebe Kessler were killed 6 hours later when the perimeter was overrun, Harrison said, delivering information that changed the moral calculus of decisions made years ago under circumstances that couldn't be recreated or adequately judged by those who hadn't been present. The room fell silent as Mylene processed the implications of information that recontextualized her military service and the circumstances that had led to her discharge. The 14 wounded personnel had been evacuated successfully, but the cost had been the lives of those who had volunteered for a mission that she had refused. Harrison closed the folder, the gesture indicating that the interrogation phase of their conversation was complete and that whatever came next would determine whether her carefully constructed civilian life could continue or whether her past would reclaim her for purposes that she had spent years trying to avoid. "Dr. Carter," he said, using her civilian title in a way that suggested recognition of the identity she had built despite the military history that had shaped her. "The mission I'm here to discuss requires someone with your specific combination of medical expertise and combat experience. Someone who understands the cost of difficult decisions and has the judgment to make them when lives depend on getting them right." Dr. Patricia Whitman had been reviewing personnel files when the secure communication arrived on her classified terminal, a device that most of Denver General's staff didn't know existed in her office. The message was brief, encoded with priority markers that indicated information requiring immediate attention from someone with her specific security clearance. What she read made her reach for the bourbon she kept in her desk drawer for particularly difficult days. The terminal displayed service records that she recognized, immediately medical personnel attached to Special Operations Command during the most intensive phases of combat operations in Afghanistan. Names, faces, and service histories of individuals whose contributions had been classified at levels that prevented public recognition of their sacrifice and expertise. Among the files was a photograph that stopped her cold. Staff Sergeant Mylene Carter, combat medic, standing beside a field hospital in gear that Whitman remembered wearing herself during her own deployment. The woman in the image was unmistakably her current resident, but the context revealed layers of experience that civilian medicine couldn't replicate. Whitman's own military service had ended 15 years ago when family obligations forced her to choose between continued deployment and raising her daughter as a single parent. But she maintained connections within the military medical community, relationships that provided insight into operations and personnel decisions that didn't appear in official records. The secure terminal allowed her access to classified databases that painted a picture of military medical operations during the height of combat intensity in Afghanistan. Forward surgical teams operating under conditions that pushed medical practice beyond anything taught in civilian institutions. Personnel making life and death decisions under direct enemy fire, where standard protocols were luxuries that circumstances couldn't accommodate. She pulled up additional files on the 5th M Forward Surgical Team, discovering casualty statistics that told stories of heroism and loss that would never appear in public records. Medical personnel who had volunteered for missions that regular military doctrine considered unsurvivable. Combat medics who had saved lives under conditions that would have overwhelmed most civilian emergency departments. The file on Forward Operating Base Kessler contained after-action reports that documented the final defensive action of a position that had become strategically untenable. Enemy forces had surrounded the base, cutting off supply lines and evacuation routes while maintaining pressure that made continued occupation impossible. The decision to evacuate had been delayed too long, requiring desperate measures to extract personnel who couldn't defend their position indefinitely. Whitman read the tactical situation reports with the understanding that came from her own experience in similar circumstances. The base had been overrun systematically, with enemy forces using superior numbers and knowledge of local terrain to compress the defensive perimeter until evacuation became the only option for survival. But wounded personnel couldn't be moved without medical support, creating the need for volunteers to remain behind. The medical situation at Phoebe Kessler had been complicated by casualties that exceeded the capacity of standard evacuation procedures. 14 wounded personnel required continuous medical attention that couldn't be provided during transport. Someone needed to maintain medical support until a second evacuation could be organized, a mission that everyone understood would likely be fatal for those who volunteered. Staff Sergeant Carter's refusal to volunteer had been documented in official reports that characterized her decision as evidence of psychological breakdown under combat stress. The psychological evaluation that followed had noted symptoms consistent with combat fatigue, but Whitman recognized signs that the evaluating psychiatrist had missed indicators that suggested intelligence rather than cowardice. She accessed classified intelligence reports that provided context for the tactical situation at Phoebe Kessler, information that hadn't been available to the personnel making decisions during the evacuation. Enemy forces had been significantly larger than initial estimates suggested, with capabilities that exceeded what standard defensive measures could counter. The volunteers who had remained behind had faced overwhelming odds that made their sacrifice inevitable rather than heroic, but the intelligence reports also revealed information that changed the moral calculus of Carter's refusal. Satellite imagery and intercepted communications indicated that enemy forces had planned to use captured American medical personnel for propaganda purposes, keeping them alive long enough to extract information that could compromise ongoing operations. Throughout the region, Carter's excessive risk aversion had prevented the enemy from capturing someone whose knowledge of special operations medical procedures could have been used to target American forces. Her refusal to volunteer hadn't just saved her own life. It had protected classified information that could have cost dozens of additional lives if it had fallen into enemy hands. Whitman cross-referenced Carter's psychological evaluation with her performance during subsequent civilian medical training, discovering patterns that told a different story than the official military assessment. Medical school grades that indicated exceptional performance under pressure. Residency evaluations that praised her ability to make difficult decisions with limited information. Patient outcomes that consistently exceeded statistical expectations for someone with her level of experience. The psychological profile that had ended Carter's military career described someone whose combat stress responses had manifested as hypervigilance and excessive caution rather than the more common symptoms of emotional numbing or aggressive behavior. The evaluating psychiatrist had interpreted these responses as indicators of unfitness for continued service, missing the possibility that they represented adaptive responses to prolonged exposure to life-threatening situations. Whitman's own experience with combat stress had taught her to recognize the difference between psychological breakdown and psychological evolution. Personnel who survived extended combat deployments often developed threat assessment capabilities that exceeded normal parameters, not because they were damaged, but because they had learned to process information that others couldn't detect or understand. She opened a secure communication channel to Colonel Harrison, using protocols that ensured their conversation couldn't be intercepted or recorded by unauthorized personnel. The connection took several minutes to establish, rooted through encryption systems that protected military communications from both foreign intelligence services and domestic oversight. Patricia, Harrison's voice carried the familiarity of shared service and mutual respect that transcended rank differences. I assume you've reviewed the files I sent regarding Dr. Carter. I have, Whitman replied, choosing her words carefully despite the secure channel. The official assessment of her military service doesn't align with what I've observed during her civilian medical practice. Her performance here suggests capabilities that weren't properly evaluated during her discharge proceedings. The conversation continued with the careful language that military personnel used when discussing classified operations, but Whitman's meaning was clear. Carter's civilian medical practice demonstrated competencies that contradicted the psychological evaluation that had ended her. Military career. Harrison provided additional context that hadn't been included in the written files. Information about the tactical situation at FOB Kessler that painted a picture of impossible choices, made under circumstances that couldn't be adequately judged by those who hadn't been present. The enemy forces that had overrun the base had included specialists trained in extracting information from captured medical personnel. Her refusal to volunteer wasn't cowardice, Harrison explained, his voice carrying the weight of intelligence. That had been classified for reasons of operational security. It was tactical awareness that prevented an intelligence compromise that could have resulted in dozens of additional casualties throughout the region. The revelation reframed Carter's military service in ways that challenged every assumption about her psychological fitness and professional competence. Her so-called breakdown had been intelligence. Her excessive caution had been wisdom that had saved lives in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Whitman accessed additional files that documented Carter's civilian medical training, looking for patterns that might indicate continued psychological effects from her military service. Instead, she found evidence of someone who had channeled combat experience into medical excellence, using threat assessment skills to improve patient outcomes in ways that her colleagues couldn't replicate. The trauma protocols that Carter had developed during her residency incorporated risk assessment procedures that weren't part of standard emergency medicine. Her patient survival rates exceeded statistical norms for someone with her level of experience, particularly in cases involving multiple trauma or time-critical interventions. Dr. Kevin Marshall had documented several instances where Carter's modifications to standard procedures had resulted in successful outcomes that wouldn't have been possible through conventional treatment approaches. Her ability to anticipate complications and prepare for multiple contingencies had impressed attending physicians who couldn't explain how she knew to expect problems that weren't apparent from initial presentations. The psychological evaluation that Dr. Rebecca Foster had conducted during Carter's hospital employment had noted stress responses that were consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, but Foster's recommendations had focused on monitoring rather than treatment. Carter's coping mechanisms were functional, her performance was exceptional, and her interactions with colleagues were appropriate despite underlying psychological tensions. Foster's confidential notes, accessible through Whitman's security clearance, revealed observations that painted a picture of someone who had successfully adapted combat psychology to civilian medical practice. Carter's hypervigilance manifested as exceptional situational awareness that improved patient care. Her risk aversion had become systematic preparation that prevented medical errors. The secure terminal provided access to after-action reports from other personnel who had served with Carter during her military deployment, testimonials that contradicted the official assessment that had ended her career. Combat medics who had worked alongside her described someone whose judgment under pressure had been consistently superior to that of her peers. Sergeant First Class Angela Rodriguez had written a detailed account of Carter's performance during a convoy ambush that had resulted in multiple casualties requiring immediate medical attention under direct enemy fire. Carter's decisions during the engagement had saved lives that would have been lost if standard protocols had been followed, but her modifications to established procedures had been noted as evidence of inability to follow orders. The pattern was consistent throughout Carter's service record. Exceptional performance that was characterized as insubordination because it deviated from established doctrine. Her excessive risk aversion had actually been a superior threat assessment that had prevented unnecessary casualties, but military psychology wasn't equipped to distinguish between adaptive caution and pathological fear. Whitman compiled a comprehensive assessment that drew on her own combat medical experience and her observations of Carter's civilian practice, creating a profile that challenged every assumption about her psychological fitness and professional competence. The woman who had been discharged for cowardice was actually someone whose combat experience had evolved into medical capabilities that exceeded normal parameters. the communication from Harrison had included mission parameters for an operation that required medical personnel with specific qualifications that couldn't be found through normal military channels. The scenario involved deployment to a hostile environment where standard protocols wouldn't apply, where medical personnel would need to function independently under conditions that would overwhelm most civilian physicians. Carter's combination of combat experience and civilian medical training made her uniquely qualified for an operation that required someone who could provide advanced medical care under conditions where support systems weren't available. Her psychological profile, properly interpreted, indicated resilience rather than weakness, intelligence rather than cowardice. Whitman's final assessment concluded that Carter's military discharge had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how combat stress manifested in personnel who had successfully adapted to extreme environments. Her excessive risk aversion was actually sophisticated threat assessment that had saved lives and preserved operational security. The irony was profound. The woman who had been labeled a coward for refusing a suicide mission had actually demonstrated the kind of tactical intelligence that was essential for the mission Harrison was now proposing. Her refusal to volunteer for certain death at FOB Kessler had preserved capabilities that were needed for an operation where survival required exactly the kind of judgment that had been characterized as psychological weakness. The stage was set for a revelation that would force Carter to confront the possibility that her greatest perceived failure had actually been her most important success, and that the psychological evaluation that had ended her military career had missed the very qualities that made her essential for a mission that no one else was qualified to undertake. The secure conference room had been transformed into something resembling a military briefing facility, complete with projection equipment that displayed classified imagery from satellites and reconnaissance drones. Colonel Harrison stood beside a tactical display that showed a remote facility in the mountains of eastern Syria, where American intelligence assets had been compromised in ways that required immediate intervention. Dr. Patricia Whitman entered the room carrying files that contained her assessment of Mylene's psychological profile and military service record, documentation that would challenge every assumption about the circumstances that had ended her combat medical career. The information she had compiled over the past 72 hours painted a picture of someone whose perceived weakness had actually been tactical intelligence that had saved lives and preserved operational security. Mylene sat at the conference table, still processing the revelations from her confrontation with Harrison, struggling to reconcile the official narrative of her military service with information that suggested her refusal to volunteer for the suicide mission at FOB Kessler had been the right decision for reasons she had never understood. The psychological evaluation that had branded her a coward was being systematically dismantled by people who had access to classified information that provided context for decisions made under impossible circumstances. The mission parameters I'm about to discuss are classified at levels that require additional security clearances. Harrison began activating the projection system that displayed satellite imagery of a facility that appeared to be a medical research complex built into mountainous terrain that would make conventional military assault impossible. What you're looking at is a bioweapons laboratory operated by a state-sponsored terrorist organization that has acquired American research data through a security breach that occurred 6 weeks ago. The images showed a fortified compound designed to withstand both airstrikes and ground assault, with defensive positions that indicated the facility's operators understood they would eventually face military intervention. But the most significant feature was a medical wing that appeared to be conducting research on biological agents that could be weaponized for use against civilian populations. Intelligence indicates that the facility is developing countermeasures to American biological defense protocols. Harrison continued, advancing to slides that showed detailed analysis of the compound's defensive capabilities. The research being conducted there could neutralize vaccines and treatments that protect our military personnel and civilian population from biological attacks. Whitman consulted her files, cross-referencing the mission parameters, with her assessment of personnel requirements for an operation that would push medical capabilities beyond anything that standard military doctrine could accommodate. The facilities location made conventional evacuation procedures impossible, requiring medical personnel who could function independently under conditions where support systems wouldn't be available. The security breach that compromised American research data included medical protocols for treating biological weapons exposure, Harrison explained, displaying classified documents that showed the scope of information that had been stolen. The enemy now has detailed knowledge of our defensive capabilities and is developing agents specifically designed to overcome our countermeasures. The implications were staggering: biological weapons that could bypass American defensive systems, creating casualties on a scale that would overwhelm any conventional medical response. The facility had to be neutralized before the research could be completed, but its location and defenses made a successful assault nearly impossible. Conventional military options have been evaluated and rejected, Harrison said, advancing to tactical analysis that showed why standard approaches wouldn't succeed. The facility is built into a mountain complex that would require sustained bombardment to penetrate, but that would also destroy the research data that we need to recover. We need to know what they've developed and how to counter it. The mission required a small team that could infiltrate the facility, neutralize the biological weapons research, and extract intelligence that would allow American forces to develop countermeasures. But the medical complications of operating in a contaminated environment, where biological weapons were being actively researched, required expertise that few people possessed. The team composition is necessarily limited, Harrison continued, displaying organizational charts that showed the minimal personnel required for the operation. 4 special operations soldiers, 1 intelligence specialist, and 1 medical officer with specific qualifications that can't be found through normal military channels. Mylene understood immediately why she was being briefed on an operation that exceeded anything in her military experience. The medical officer would need to function in a biological weapons environment while providing trauma care to team members who might be exposed to agents that had no known treatment protocols. It was exactly the kind of impossible mission that had ended her military career when she had refused similar assignments. The medical requirements include expertise in biological weapons exposure, trauma surgery under field conditions, and the ability to function independently without support systems, Harrison said, reading from specifications that might have been written specifically for someone with Mylene's background. Most importantly, the medical officer must be capable of making difficult decisions under pressure when standard protocols don't apply. Whitman opened her assessment files, preparing to present information that would challenge the psychological evaluation that had branded Mylene unfit for military service. The documentation she had compiled painted a picture of someone whose combat experience had evolved into capabilities that exceeded normal parameters for both military and civilian medical practice. Dr. Carter's refusal to volunteer for the rearguard action at Phoebe Kessler was characterized as evidence of psychological breakdown, Whitman began, reading from military records that had shaped Mylene's civilian identity. But classified intelligence about the tactical situation reveals that her decision prevented a security compromise that could have resulted in dozens of additional casualties. The revelation hit Mylene like physical force, challenging everything she had believed about her military service and the circumstances that had led to her discharge. The suicide mission she had refused had actually been an intelligence trap that would have compromised operational security throughout the region. Enemy forces at Phoebe Kessler included specialists trained in extracting information from captured medical personnel. Whitman continued, reading from intelligence reports that hadn't been available during the original psychological evaluation. Staff Sergeant Carter's knowledge of special operations medical procedures would have been used to target American forces if she had been captured. The psychological evaluation that had ended her military career had been based on incomplete information, missing the tactical intelligence that made her refusal to volunteer a strategically sound decision rather than an act of cowardice. Her excessive risk aversion had actually been a superior threat assessment that had preserved capabilities needed for future operations. Harrison advanced to personnel files that showed the fate of the volunteers who had remained behind at FOB Kessler, information that had been classified to protect operational security, but painted a picture of sacrifice that had been both heroic and unnecessary. The 6 medical personnel who had volunteered for the rear guard action had been killed when the base perimeter was overrun, but their sacrifice hadn't saved the wounded personnel they had remained to protect. The 14 wounded personnel at FOB Kessler were successfully evacuated by helicopter after reinforcements secured the perimeter. Harrison read from after-action reports that documented the outcome of the evacuation. The volunteers who remained behind died 6 hours before the evacuation could be completed. The tactical situation had been misunderstood by everyone involved, including the commanding officers who had requested volunteers for what they believed was a necessary sacrifice. Enemy forces had been significantly larger than intelligence estimates suggested, making the defensive action futile regardless of how many personnel remained behind. Dr. Carter's refusal to volunteer was the only decision that preserved medical capabilities needed for subsequent operations, Whitman said, consulting psychological profiles that reinterpreted combat stress responses as adaptive intelligence rather than pathological fear. Her excessive caution saved lives in ways that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The pattern was consistent throughout Mylene's military service: superior performance that had been characterized as insubordination because it deviated from established doctrine. Her modifications to standard medical procedures had resulted in casualty rates that exceeded statistical norms, but her willingness to challenge protocols had been noted as evidence of inability to follow orders. The psychological evaluation that recommended Dr. Carter's discharge noted symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, Whitman continued, reading from assessments that had focused on pathology rather than adaptation. But her stress responses were actually indicators of evolved threat assessment capabilities that improved her effectiveness under pressure. Harrison displayed comparative analysis that showed how Mylene's civilian medical practice had incorporated lessons learned from combat experience, creating treatment protocols that exceeded standard emergency medicine in ways that her colleagues couldn't explain. Her ability to anticipate complications and prepare for multiple contingencies had resulted in patient outcomes that consistently exceeded statistical expectations. The mission I'm proposing requires exactly the kind of tactical intelligence that characterized Dr. Carter's military service, Harrison said, returning to the tactical display that showed the Syrian facility. Someone who can assess threats that others miss, who can modify procedures when standard protocols would result in unnecessary casualties. The irony was profound. The woman who had been discharged for refusing a suicide mission was being recruited for an operation that required precisely the kind of judgment that had been characterized as psychological weakness. Her refusal to volunteer for certain death at FOB Kessler had preserved capabilities that were essential for a mission where survival depended on the ability to recognize when following orders would be fatal. The biological weapons research being conducted at this facility could result in casualties on a scale that would make 9/11s look like a minor incident, Harrison continued, displaying intelligence estimates that showed the potential scope of a successful biological attack. Hundreds of thousands of American civilians could die if this research is completed and weaponized. The stakes exceeded anything Mylene had encountered during her military service, But the mission parameters were similar to scenarios she had faced in Afghanistan: impossible odds, minimal support, and the certainty that failure would result in consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The team insertion will be conducted through high-altitude, low-opening parachute deployment that will put personnel on the ground 12 kilometers from the target facility, Harrison said, displaying infiltration routes that would require movement through hostile territory without support systems. Extraction is contingent on mission success and will be attempted 72 hours after insertion. The timeline was aggressive, the margin for error virtually non-existent, and the probability of survival low enough that the mission qualified as a suicide assignment that exceeded anything Mylene had refused during her military career. But the intelligence Harrison was providing suggested that this was exactly the kind of operation where her tactical awareness could make the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "Dr. Carter," Harrison said, addressing her directly for the first time since the briefing began, "the psychological evaluation that ended your military career was wrong. Your refusal to volunteer for the suicide mission at FOB Kessler wasn't cowardice. It was intelligence that saved lives and preserved capabilities that are needed now." The revelation reframed everything Mylene had believed about her military service and the circumstances that had led to her civilian medical career. The decision that had branded her a coward had actually demonstrated the kind of tactical judgment that was essential for operations where survival required the ability to recognize when following orders would be suicidal. "The mission I'm proposing is voluntary," Harrison continued, acknowledging the parallel between the current situation and the circumstances that had ended her military career. "But unlike FOB Kessler, this operation has a realistic probability of success if it's executed by personnel who understand the difference between necessary risks and suicidal gestures." The choice was hers, but the information Harrison and Whitman had provided suggested that everything she had believed about her military service had been based on incomplete intelligence and flawed psychological assessment. The woman who had been discharged for excessive risk aversion was being offered the opportunity to volunteer for a mission that required exactly the kind of judgment that had been characterized as her greatest weakness. The silence that followed Harrison's revelation stretched through the conference room like a living thing, heavy with the weight of decisions that would reshape everything Mylene had believed about herself for the past 5 years. She stared at the tactical display showing the Syrian facility, but her mind was processing information that went far beyond mission parameters and operational requirements. The psychological reconstruction of her military service felt like emotional surgery performed without anesthesia. Every assumption about her character, every moment of self-doubt that had driven her toward civilian medicine, every night she had lain awake questioning whether she was fundamentally flawed, all of it was being systematically dismantled by classified intelligence that painted her refusal to volunteer as an act of tactical brilliance rather than cowardice. Dr. Patricia Whitman watched Mylene's face carefully, recognizing the signs of someone whose entire self-concept was being reorganized in real time. The psychological evaluation that had ended her military career had been more than a professional assessment. It had become the foundation of her civilian identity, the narrative that explained why she had traded combat medicine for the relative safety of hospital emergency rooms. "I need a moment," Mylene said, her voice carrying the strain of someone trying to process information that challenged fundamental beliefs about her own character. The room felt suddenly claustrophobic, the weight of classified information and military expectations pressing against the psychological defenses that had been carefully constructed over years of civilian practice. Harrison nodded, understanding that the revelation he had just delivered required time to integrate into a worldview that had been shaped by incomplete information and flawed psychological assessment. The woman sitting across from him was discovering that her greatest perceived failure had actually been her most significant success. That the decision that had branded her a coward had demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligence that made her essential for the current mission. Mylene stood and walked to the window that overlooked Denver General Hospital, the facility where she had rebuilt her life around competence and professional respect, rather than the heroism and recognition that military service might have provided. The trauma bay where she had spent the last 3 years was visible from her position, a reminder of the civilian identity she had constructed from the ruins of her military career. The revelation about FOB Kessler forced her to re-examine every decision she had made since her discharge, every moment when she had chosen safety over risk, every time she had stepped back from leadership opportunities, because she believed herself fundamentally unsuited for situations where lives depended on her judgment under pressure. The psychological evaluation that had branded her excessively risk-averse had shaped her civilian practice in ways that now seemed tragically ironic. Her work at Denver General had been exemplary precisely because she applied the same tactical awareness that had been characterized as pathological caution during her military service. Her ability to anticipate complications, her insistence on backup protocols, her systematic approach to emergency medicine, all of it stemmed from combat experience that had taught her to prepare for scenarios that others couldn't imagine. The 14 wounded at FOB Kessler, Mylene said, without turning from the window, her voice carrying the weight of guilt that had shaped her civilian identity. I convinced myself that I had abandoned them, that someone else had to risk their life, because I was too scared to do my job. Whitman consulted her files, preparing to deliver information that would challenge another fundamental assumption about the circumstances that had ended Mylene's military career. The classified intelligence about FOB Kessler contained details that painted a picture of tactical confusion and intelligence failures that had resulted in impossible choices for personnel who lacked complete information about the strategic situation. The 14 wounded personnel were evacuated successfully 6 hours after you left the base, Whitman said, reading from after-action reports that documented the timeline of events. The volunteers who remained behind were killed 3 hours before the helicopter extraction could be completed. Your refusal to volunteer didn't abandon anyone. It preserved the medical expertise that was essential for subsequent operations. The information struck Mylene with the force of revelation, challenging the narrative of abandonment and cowardice that had defined her transition to civilian life. The wounded personnel she thought she had abandoned had been saved by decisions made by people with access to intelligence that hadn't been available to her during the crisis. Harrison activated additional displays that showed the broader tactical situation in Afghanistan during the period when FOB Kessler was evacuated, intelligence that revealed how her refusal to volunteer had preserved capabilities that were essential for operations throughout the region. The special operations medical protocols that she understood could have been compromised if she had been captured, potentially resulting in dozens of additional casualties. Your psychological evaluation noted that you asked questions about mission parameters that exceeded normal tactical concerns, Harrison said, reading from assessments that had characterized her intelligence as evidence of mental instability. You wanted to know about enemy capabilities, extraction procedures, and survival probabilities that other personnel hadn't considered. The pattern was consistent throughout her military service: exceptional analytical capabilities that had been characterized as excessive anxiety because they exceeded the parameters that psychological evaluators expected from combat medical personnel. Her ability to process complex threat information and anticipate scenarios that others missed had been noted as evidence of pathological worry rather than tactical intelligence. The questions you asked about FOB Kessler demonstrated understanding of strategic implications that went beyond what your rank and position should have provided, Whitman added, consulting psychological profiles that revealed the depth of Mylene's analytical capabilities. You recognized that the tactical situation was more complex than initial briefings suggested. The revelation forced Mylene to reconsider not just her military service, but her entire approach to civilian medicine. The hypervigilance that had been characterized as pathological had actually evolved threat assessment that improved her effectiveness in emergency situations. Her insistence on backup protocols and contingency planning had resulted in patient outcomes that consistently exceeded statistical expectations. She turned from the window to face Harrison and Whitman, her expression carrying the weight of someone whose fundamental self-concept had been challenged by information that contradicted everything she had believed about her own character. The woman who had spent 5 years believing herself to be fundamentally flawed was discovering that her perceived weakness had actually been her greatest strength. "The mission you're proposing," Mylene said, her voice steadier now as she began to process the implications of what she had learned. "It's the same kind of impossible situation that ended my military career. But this time you're saying that the judgment that got me discharged is exactly what makes me qualified." Harrison nodded, recognizing that she was beginning to understand the parallel between her past refusal and the current situation. The bioweapons facility in Syria represented exactly the kind of scenario where tactical intelligence was more important than blind courage, where survival depended on the ability to recognize when standard protocols would be suicidal. The team composition for this mission has been designed based on analysis of what went wrong at Phoebe Kessler and similar operations, Harrison explained, displaying organizational charts that showed how lessons learned from tactical failures had shaped current doctrine. "We need personnel who can think independently when communication with command isn't possible, who can modify procedures when standard protocols would result in mission failure." The Syrian facility presented challenges that exceeded anything in conventional military doctrine. The biological contamination made standard medical procedures potentially lethal, requiring improvisations that could only be developed by someone with extensive experience in modifying protocols under pressure. The defensive capabilities of the facility made extraction contingent on mission success, eliminating the possibility of retreat if initial objectives weren't achieved. The probability of survival is estimated at approximately 30%. Harrison said, delivering statistics that would have deterred most potential volunteers. But the probability of mission success increases significantly with medical personnel, who understand the difference between acceptable risks and suicidal gestures. Mylene studied the tactical displays that showed infiltration routes and extraction procedures, applying the same analytical capabilities that had been characterized as excessive during her military service. The mission parameters were aggressive but not impossible, requiring exactly the kind of tactical awareness that had made her refuse the suicide assignment at Phoebe Kessler. The biological weapons research being conducted at this facility could neutralize American defensive capabilities, Whitman added, consulting intelligence estimates that showed the potential scope of casualties from a successful biological attack. "The research data we need to recover could prevent civilian casualties on a scale that would exceed anything in American history." The stakes were higher than anything Mylene had encountered during her military service, but the mission structure was designed to maximize survival probability rather than simply accepting casualties as inevitable. The team would be composed of personnel who had been selected for their ability to adapt to changing circumstances rather than their willingness to follow orders that might prove fatal. "Dr. Carter," Harrison said, using her civilian title in acknowledgement of the identity she had built during her transition from military to medical practice. "The psychological evaluation that ended your military career was based on incomplete intelligence and flawed assessment criteria. Your refusal to volunteer for the suicide mission at Phoebe Kessler demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment that we need for this operation." The irony was profound but no longer painful. The decision that had branded her a coward was being reframed as evidence of the intelligence that made her essential for a mission where survival required the ability to recognize when heroic gestures would be counterproductive. Her excessive risk aversion had evolved into sophisticated threat assessment that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "The choice is entirely yours," Harrison continued, acknowledging that the parallel between her past refusal and the current situation created psychological complexities that went beyond normal recruitment procedures. "But the intelligence we've provided about your military service should inform your decision about whether to volunteer for this mission." Mylene understood that she was being offered more than just the opportunity to participate in a classified operation. She was being given the chance to redefine her relationship with courage, to discover whether the woman who had been discharged for cowardice could volunteer for a mission that required exactly the kind of judgment that had ended her military career. The conference room fell silent as she processed the weight of a decision that would determine whether her civilian identity represented retreat from military service or evolution toward capabilities that exceeded what conventional doctrine could accommodate. The woman who had spent 5 years believing herself fundamentally flawed was discovering that her perceived weakness might actually be the qualification that made her essential for preventing a catastrophe that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The reckoning was complete. Her military service had been recontextualized, her psychological evaluation had been challenged, and her civilian achievements had been reframed as evidence of capabilities that exceeded normal parameters. The only question remaining was whether she could volunteer for the kind of mission that had once seemed impossible. Armed with the knowledge that her refusal to accept certain death had actually demonstrated the intelligence that could prevent it. The words came quietly, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of a decision that would reshape not just Mylene's future, but her understanding of everything she had been running from for the past 5 years. "I volunteer." Colonel Harrison had conducted dozens of recruitment meetings for classified operations, but few had carried the psychological complexity of convincing someone to embrace the very type of mission that had ended their military career. The silence that followed Mylene's acceptance stretched through moments that felt like hours, acknowledging that this wasn't just operational consent, but personal transformation. Dr. Patricia Whitman closed her assessment files, recognizing that the psychological reconstruction they had just completed represented more than mission preparation. It was the restoration of a warrior's identity that had been damaged by incomplete intelligence and flawed evaluation. The woman sitting across from them was no longer the discharged combat medic who believed herself fundamentally broken, but someone discovering that her greatest perceived failure had actually been her most significant success. The mission preparation began immediately, but the protocols differed significantly from the military training that had characterized Mylene's previous service. The team she would join had been assembled based on lessons learned from operations where conventional doctrine had failed, where survival had depended on personnel who could think independently when standard procedures would prove fatal. Captain Sarah Chun, the team's intelligence specialist, arrived at the secure facility carrying biographical information about the Syrian bioweapons researchers that painted a picture of scientists who had been coerced into weapons development through threats against their families. The intelligence suggested that neutralizing the facility might require medical intervention rather than simply destroying the research, creating scenarios where Mylene's dual expertise in combat medicine and threat assessment would be essential. Team's commanding officer, Major Marcus Thompson, had requested specific personnel based on analysis of previous special operations failures in similar environments. His requirements included medical personnel who could function independently under biological contamination conditions, but more importantly, someone who understood the difference between necessary risks and suicidal gestures. Thompson's briefing emphasized the mission's complexity in ways that went beyond standard operational parameters. The bioweapons facility was defended by personnel who understood they were conducting research that would eventually attract military intervention, creating a tactical situation where conventional assault methods would likely result in the destruction of intelligence that was essential for developing countermeasures. The facility's defensive posture suggests they're prepared for siege warfare rather than rapid assault, Thompson explained, displaying reconnaissance imagery that showed defensive positions designed to channel attacking forces into kill zones. But their preparations assume conventional military tactics that we're not going to use. The infiltration plan required techniques that pushed special operations doctrine beyond established parameters, combining high-altitude insertion with extended movement through hostile territory where detection would mean certain death. The team would operate without communication support for 72 hours, making independent decision-making essential when circumstances exceeded mission planning assumptions. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's senior NCO, had requested Mylene specifically after reviewing her military service record and civilian medical performance. His assessment focused on her ability to maintain medical capabilities under conditions where standard protocols would be compromised by biological contamination and limited resources. "Doc," Rodriguez said, using the informal address that combat medics earned through competence rather than rank. "The psychological evaluation that got you discharged noted that you asked too many questions about mission parameters. In this operation, asking the right questions might be the only thing that keeps us alive." The tactical situation required medical preparedness that exceeded anything in conventional military doctrine. The team would be operating in an environment where biological weapons were being actively researched, creating contamination risks that could render standard medical procedures lethal to both patients and medical personnel. Mylene spent 3 days reviewing classified research on biological weapons countermeasures, studying agents that had been developed specifically to overcome American defensive capabilities. The intelligence painted a picture of weapons designed to cause casualties on a scale that would overwhelm any conventional medical response, requiring treatment protocols that didn't exist in any manual. The psychological preparation proved more challenging than the technical training. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the same psychiatrist who had evaluated Mylene during her hospital employment, conducted sessions designed to help her process the revelation that her military discharge had been based on flawed assessment and incomplete intelligence. "Your refusal to volunteer at FOB Kessler wasn't evidence of psychological breakdown," Foster explained during one of their conversations. "It was tactical intelligence that saved lives and preserved capabilities that are essential for the current mission. The evaluation that ended your military career was wrong." The sessions revealed how profoundly the cowardice label had shaped Mylene's civilian identity, influencing every decision she had made about risk, leadership, and professional advancement. Her transition to hospital medicine hadn't just been career change. It had been retreat from situations where her judgment might be tested under conditions similar to those that had ended her military service. "Your hypervigilance and risk assessment capabilities weren't pathological responses to combat stress," Foster continued, helping Mylene understand how her psychological evolution had actually enhanced her medical practice. "They were adaptive intelligence that improved your effectiveness in emergency situations." The revelation transformed her understanding of every successful patient outcome during her civilian medical career. The complications she had anticipated, the backup protocol she had insisted on, the systematic approach that had impressed attending physicians, all of it stemmed from combat experience that had taught her to prepare for scenarios that others couldn't imagine. The team's final briefing took place in a secure facility that replicated the environmental conditions they would encounter in the Syrian mountains, complete with biological containment protocols that would be essential for operating in a contaminated research facility. The mission timeline was aggressive but realistic, designed around survival probability rather than simply accepting casualties as inevitable. Extraction is contingent on mission success, Thompson emphasized, acknowledging that retreat wasn't an option if initial objectives weren't achieved. But the intelligence we recover could prevent civilian casualties that would exceed anything in American history. The bioweapons research being conducted at the facility represented an existential threat that went beyond normal military concerns. The agents being developed could neutralize American biological defenses, creating weapons that could cause casualties on a scale that would reshape global power dynamics and potentially collapse civilian medical infrastructure. Mylene understood that she was volunteering for exactly the kind of mission that had once seemed impossible, but armed with knowledge that refrained her tactical judgment as essential qualification rather than psychological weakness. The woman who had been discharged for excessive risk aversion was discovering that her intelligence was precisely what made survival possible when courage alone would be suicidal. The insertion went according to plan, 12,000 feet above the Syrian mountains, where the team deployed through high-altitude, low-opening parachutes that deposited them in terrain that would provide concealment during the approach march. The facility was exactly as intelligence had described, fortified, but not impregnable, defended by personnel who understood conventional military tactics but hadn't prepared for the unconventional approach that Thompson's team represented. The biological containment protocols that Mylene had developed during mission preparation proved essential when the team breached the research facility and discovered contamination levels that exceeded intelligence estimates. Standard military doctrine would have required withdrawal, but her modifications to decontamination procedures allowed the team to continue the mission while maintaining safety margins that preserved their ability to function. The Syrian researchers were indeed working under coercion, their families held hostage to ensure compliance with weapons development that violated every principle of medical ethics. Mylene's medical intervention prevented their execution by facility security forces, but more importantly, her tactical judgment recognized that these scientists represented intelligence assets, whose knowledge was essential for developing countermeasures. Mission success depended on decisions that required exactly the kind of analytical capability that had been characterized as excessive during her military service. When standard extraction procedures proved impossible due to changed tactical conditions, her modifications to contingency plans preserved team survival while ensuring that essential intelligence could be recovered. The bioweapons research data they extracted revealed weapons development that would have rendered American biological defenses obsolete, potentially causing civilian casualties on a scale that would have exceeded the September 11th attacks by orders of magnitude. The intelligence enabled the development of countermeasures that neutralized the threat, while providing protection against similar weapons that might be developed by other hostile actors. The team returned to American soil 76 hours after insertion. Mission accomplished with 0 casualties and intelligence recovered that would protect American civilian populations from biological weapons that had been designed specifically to overcome existing defenses. The operation was classified at levels that prevented public recognition, but the lives saved numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Mylene's performance during the mission had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in her previous military service, validating the assessment that her tactical intelligence was essential for operations where conventional courage would be counterproductive. Her ability to adapt medical protocols under impossible conditions had preserved team effectiveness while ensuring mission success. The psychological evaluation that followed the mission painted a picture of someone whose combat stress responses had evolved into analytical capabilities that enhanced rather than diminished her effectiveness under pressure. The hypervigilance that had been characterized as pathological was actually sophisticated threat assessment that improved decision-making when lives depended on getting choices right. Colonel Harrison's final assessment concluded that Mylene's military discharge had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how combat psychology manifested in personnel who had successfully adapted to extreme environments. Her excessive risk aversion was actually tactical intelligence that had saved lives during her previous service and proved essential for preventing catastrophic casualties during the Syrian operation. The irony was complete. The woman who had been branded a coward for refusing a suicide mission had volunteered for an operation that required exactly the kind of judgment that had ended her military career. Her refusal to accept certain death at Phoebe Kessler had preserved capabilities that were essential for preventing biological weapons attacks that could have killed hundreds of thousands of American civilians. Dr. Patricia Whitman's final report documented the psychological transformation that had occurred when classified intelligence provided context for decisions that had been misunderstood by evaluators who lacked complete information about tactical situations. The assessment that had branded Mylene unfit for military service had actually identified capabilities that exceeded normal parameters for both military and civilian medical practice. The Syrian mission became a case study in special operations doctrine, demonstrating how personnel who had been characterized as unsuitable for combat assignments could possess exactly the qualifications needed for operations where survival depended on intelligence rather than conventional courage. The lessons learned influenced recruitment procedures and psychological evaluation criteria throughout the special operations community. Mylene returned to Denver General Hospital, but her civilian medical practice was transformed by the knowledge that her combat experience represented evolution rather than damage. The tactical awareness that had been characterized as pathological enhanced her ability to anticipate complications and prepare for scenarios that other emergency physicians couldn't imagine. Her patient outcomes improved dramatically as she applied lessons learned from the Syrian mission to civilian emergency medicine, developing protocols that incorporated threat assessment and contingency planning in ways that reduced medical errors and improved survival rates. The hypervigilance that had been noted as evidence of psychological problems became systematic preparation that prevented complications before they could threaten patient safety. The residents and medical students who worked with Mylene began to recognize capabilities that exceeded normal parameters for civilian physicians, but her teaching methods emphasized analytical thinking and systematic preparation rather than heroic gestures or individual recognition. She had learned that the most important victories were often invisible, measured in disasters that didn't happen rather than headlines that acknowledged success. The legacy of her transformation extended beyond individual achievement to influence how the medical and military communities understood the relationship between combat stress and analytical capability. Her case became a model for recognizing when psychological responses to extreme environments represented adaptation rather than pathology, intelligence rather than weakness. The woman who had been called a coward for refusing a suicide mission had discovered that her greatest perceived failure was actually her most significant success, that the judgment that ended her military career was precisely what made her essential for preventing catastrophes that could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. She had learned that true courage wasn't the willingness to die for others, but the intelligence to live for them, to make the hard decisions that preserved capabilities needed for battles yet to be fought. In the end, the label that had defined her civilian identity, coward, had been revealed as the foundation of wisdom that could distinguish between necessary risks and futile gestures. The mission she had volunteered for in Syria had proved that the woman discharged for excessive caution possessed exactly the tactical intelligence needed when survival required the ability to recognize that sometimes the most courageous act was knowing when not to be a hero. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.